In ancient Egypt, the birth of a pharaoh was no ordinary event. To the people of the Nile Valley, the arrival of a royal child was more than just the continuation of a family line. It was the dawn of a new era. The newborn was not merely a prince or princess, but a living god in human form, destined to rule both the land of the living and the mysteries of the afterlife. From the very moment of birth, omens were sought in the skies, in the flow of the Nile, even in the cries of sacred animals. Priests studied these signs carefully, for they believed the gods themselves had spoken through them, signaling the destiny of the child. Some births were wrapped in stories of divine conception, whispered tales that a god had descended to the queen's chambers to father the child. These stories weren't just myths. They were propaganda, carefully crafted to reinforce the sacred aura of the throne. The young heir's earliest years were steeped in ritual. Nurses and attendants handled them with reverence, for every gesture toward the child was a gesture toward divinity itself. Protective amulets were hung around their cradle. Spells were chanted to guard against evil spirits, and royal tutors began weaving lessons of kingship into lullabies and stories. Even play was preparation for the throne, miniature crowns and ceremonial toys, hinting at the colossal responsibilities that lay ahead. For the people, the birth of a god king was both a reassurance and a burden. It promised stability, the continued balance of Mat, the cosmic order that kept chaos at bay. Yet it also meant that another human life would be raised under impossible expectations, carrying the weight of a divine mantle. Behind the celebrations, one couldn't ignore the darker truth. The pharaoh was destined to be both adored and feared, caught forever between the fragile human body and the eternal role of a living god. And so, from their very first breath, the pharaoh's life was never truly their own. It belonged to Egypt, to the gods, and to eternity itself. Life in ancient Egypt was inseparable from the Nile. This vast river was not simply a body of water. It was the lifeline of the entire civilization. Without it, the golden sands of the desert would have swallowed every dream of empire. With it, Egypt blossomed into one of the most enduring and remarkable societies the world has ever known. Every year, like clockwork, the Nile flooded. Its waters spilled across the floodplains, soaking the earth with rich black silt. For the farmers, this annual miracle was both terrifying and essential. Too little water, and famine loomed. Too much, and villages could be swept away. Yet when the balance was just right, the land yielded barley, wheat, vegetables, and fruits in abundance. It was this predictable rhythm that gave Egypt its reputation as the gift of the Nile. For the pharaoh, control over the Nile was more than symbolic. It was sacred. He was seen as the guarantor of its proper flooding, the human bridge between the people and the gods who controlled nature. Festivals were held to honor Hapi, the god of the river, with songs, offerings, and prayers that the waters would rise at the appointed time. Failure in this duty could spark unrest, as droughts or floods were often blamed on the pharaoh's inability to please the gods. Along its banks, life thrived in dazzling variety. Fishermen cast their nets at dawn, while boatmen steered sleek papyrus skiffs through the reeds. Traders loaded goods, copper, gold, ivory, and incense, onto barges bound for distant cities. Children splashed in the shallows, watched carefully by mothers grinding grain beneath the shade of palm trees. The Nile wasn't just sustenance, it was culture, commerce, and community all in one flowing thread. Even in death, the river's significance lingered. Tombs were aligned with its course. Funeral barges carried the dead across its waters, and its cyclical flooding mirrored the Egyptian obsession with rebirth. The Nile was more than a river. It was eternity flowing past their doorsteps. And for the pharaoh, standing at its banks each morning, the glimmering waters reflected not just the sun, but the immense responsibility of being the guardian of balance between life and chaos. To the people of Egypt, the pharaoh was no ordinary ruler. He was more than a man, more than a king. He was the earthly vessel of the gods. His duty was not simply to govern the land, but to maintain the fragile balance of Ma'at, the principle of truth, harmony, and cosmic order. Without him, it was believed, the universe itself might tip into chaos. Every day began with rituals that affirmed his sacred role. Priests prepared offerings in the temples, reciting hymns that praised him as Horus in life and Osiris in death. The pharaoh himself participated in ceremonies that connected him directly with the divine. He presented sacrifices of food, drink, incense, and precious objects, ensuring that the gods remained satisfied and, in return, kept Egypt's enemies at bay and the Nile's floods steady. But divine duty extended beyond temples. As supreme judge, the pharaoh was tasked with upholding justice throughout the kingdom. Disputes, crimes, and grievances ultimately flowed upward to him, though advisors and viziers carried out much of this work. The pharaoh's word was final. His judgments were believed to be guided by divine wisdom. To challenge them was to challenge the gods themselves. The role of war leader was equally sacred. When Egypt marched to battle, the pharaoh was portrayed not just as a general, but as a god of war in flesh, smiting enemies with the blessing of the divine. Reliefs carved into temple walls showed him larger than life, trampling foes and drawing his bow with the strength of 10,000 men. Whether or not he fought personally mattered less than the image. Egypt's enemies were chaos embodied, and the pharaoh was order's champion. Yet behind the grandeur, there was pressure. To be a god, king was to live with no room for failure. A failed harvest, a military defeat, even a bad omen in the sky, all could be laid at the feet of the pharaoh. He was trapped in a role larger than any one person could bear, expected to embody perfection while still living, breathing, and erring as a mortal. The divine crown glittered, but it was also a heavy weight. Behind the towering walls of Egypt's palaces, the pharaoh's daily world unfolded in a rhythm both dazzling and restrictive. These palaces were not like cozy homes. They were sprawling complexes of stone and plaster, decorated with painted columns, lotus motifs, and murals that told stories of power and eternity. To step inside was to step into another universe, where every detail reinforced the pharaoh's divine status. The air itself carried a different scent. Perfumed oils burned in golden lamps, mixing with the aroma of exotic spices brought from distant lands. Servants padded softly across polished floors, carrying trays of figs, honey cakes, and wine. Musicians played harps and flutes in the background, their melodies weaving into the hum of daily life. The palace was not just a residence, it was a stage. Every moment designed to remind visitors that they stood in the presence of a living god. Yet, it was also a place of endless routine. The pharaoh's mornings began with dressing rituals performed by attendants. Fine linen garments, freshly laundered and scented with lotus oil, were draped over his body. Elaborate jewelry, necklaces of gold, lapis lazuli, and carnelian, was layered piece by piece. Even the crown was chosen with care, for each headdress carried symbolic weight, from the white crown of Upper Egypt to the double crown that bound the kingdom together. Meals reflected both luxury and order. The royal table overflowed with roasted fowl, fresh fish from the Nile, baskets of bread, and jars of beer sweetened with dates. But food was more than nourishment. It was spectacle. Foreign ambassadors marveled at such abundance, reminded that Egypt's ruler commanded not only armies, but also the very bounty of nature. Still, the palace was not free of shadows. Intrigue lingered in the corridors, as advisors, priests, and family members jostled for influence. Secrets passed in whispers behind painted screens. For all its beauty, the palace could feel less like a sanctuary and more like a gilded cage, where the pharaoh lived surrounded by servants, yet often alone in responsibility. Amid opulence, the god, king, remained a prisoner of ceremony. Even at home, he belonged to the throne, to the gods, and to Egypt. Not to himself. Each dawn in ancient Egypt began with ritual. For the pharaoh, the rising of the sun was not just a natural event. It was a sacred drama in which he played the leading role. As the golden disk of Ra lifted above the horizon, it was believed that the pharaoh's duty was to greet it, ensuring that light triumphed once more over darkness. Servants and priests stirred before first light, preparing the sacred chambers. Basins of cool water were filled for purification, scented with lotus and myrrh. Fine linen towels were laid out, along with alabaster jars of perfumed oils. The chamber echoed with whispered prayers, a hush of expectation as the living god prepared to awaken. The pharaoh was bathed carefully, not simply for cleanliness, but to wash away impurity before approaching the divine. Drops of oil were smoothed onto his skin, believed to strengthen and protect his body. Every step of this process had meaning. The oils were gifts of the gods. The water symbolized rebirth, and the linens wrapped him in the order of Mat. Dressing was equally ceremonial. The garments were not chosen at random, but selected for their symbolism. A kilt of crisp white linen represented purity. A broad collar of gold and precious stones signified strength and eternal life. Rings, bracelets, and anklets marked his wealth, but also his connection to protective deities. Finally, the crown, whether the red of Lower Egypt, the white of Upper Egypt, or the combined double crown, completed the transformation, turning a man into a god before the eyes of his attendants. Prayers and hymns accompanied these rituals. Priests recited verses as incense curled toward the ceiling, carrying pleas for protection and prosperity. At the heart of it all was the pharaoh himself, silent yet central, the bridge between heaven and earth. Only after these rituals was he ready to appear in the courts, to govern, to judge, and to lead his people. But for that brief time each morning, within the sanctity of ritual, the pharaoh's humanity dissolved, and he stood renewed as the eternal embodiment of divine power. Behind the glittering walls of the palace, life at court was anything but simple. The pharaoh might have been revered as a living god, yet he was never free from the swirling currents of ambition, rivalry, and intrigue that defined the royal court. Every day, officials, nobles, and advisors gathered in the audience chambers, eager to secure favor. Some came bearing gifts, gold, exotic animals, or fine crafts from distant lands. Others offered flattery, hoping their words might win them influence. And always, beneath the formal bows and rehearsed words, hidden agendas simmered. The vizier, often the pharaoh's closest advisor, was both indispensable and potentially dangerous. With control over taxation, justice, and the bureaucracy, he wielded enormous power. Courtiers whispered about who the vizier truly served, the will of the pharaoh or his own ambitions. A raised eyebrow, a delayed word, even a subtle alliance could shift the balance of authority within the court. Queens and royal wives also played their roles in this intricate dance. Some wielded soft power through charm and diplomacy, while others were known for their sharp wit and calculated maneuvering. A single nod from a favored queen could elevate a servant's family for generations. Envoys from foreign lands brought yet another layer of intrigue. They came bearing messages from kings and chieftains, negotiating trade, alliances, or even proposing royal marriages. Their every word was weighed carefully, for behind their honeyed diplomacy often lay the threat of war. The court was a place of masks. Smiles hid jealousy, oaths hid betrayal, and loyalty could shift as quickly as the Nile's floodwaters. Yet, through all the whispers and rivalries, the pharaoh stood as the axis around which this complex world spun. His favor meant survival. His displeasure meant ruin. To the people outside the palace walls, the court was a place of mystery and splendor. But within, it was a battlefield fought with words, glances, and secrets, where power was the ultimate prize and trust was the rarest commodity of all. For the Egyptians, the pharaoh was far more than a political ruler. He was the bridge between the earthly and the divine. His every action was thought to shape the balance of the universe. To rule Egypt was not merely to govern. It was to embody Mat, the cosmic order of truth, balance, and justice. Each dawn, as the sun rose over the Nile, priests performed rituals in the temples, invoking the gods and renewing Egypt's harmony. But though priests carried out the rites, it was the pharaoh who bore ultimate responsibility. His presence was etched into every offering, every prayer, every festival. Without him, the cycle of life risked unraveling. Festivals celebrated his sacred role. At the Feast of Opet in Thebes, colossal statues of the gods were paraded through the streets, while crowds chanted blessings for the pharaoh's reign. His appearance at these events was more than ceremonial. It reassured the people that the gods still smiled upon Egypt. Even war was framed as a divine duty. When the pharaoh marched into battle, he was not just defending borders. He was vanquishing chaos itself. Enemies were depicted on temple walls as forces of disorder, trampled beneath the pharaoh's chariot wheels. Victory was not only a matter of politics, it was proof that Egypt's divine order remained secure. At the heart of it all was the belief that the pharaoh's well-being was directly tied to the prosperity of the land. If crops failed, if the Nile's floods were weak, if plagues struck, whispers spread that the ruler had faltered in his duties to the gods. A strong, just pharaoh meant abundance. A weak or corrupt one invited disaster. To sit upon the throne of Egypt was to carry the weight of the cosmos itself. Every ritual, every decree, every triumph was a thread in the vast tapestry of divine order. And though the pharaoh was mortal, his role bound him to eternity, an earthly vessel of godly will. Though cloaked in godhood, the pharaoh was still a man who lived within walls of stone and ritual. His daily routine was a careful blend of ceremony, governance, and fleeting glimpses of personal life. At dawn, priests entered his chambers to awaken him with hymns. The rising sun, seen as the god Ra himself, was greeted alongside the ruler's first breath of the day. Ritual ablutions followed. Water poured from sacred vessels, scented oils applied, fine linen garments draped upon his body. Even the act of dressing was steeped in symbolism, every jewel and headdress affirming his divine authority. After these rites, the pharaoh took his place in audience halls. Officials lined up, scrolls in hand, ready to present matters of law, taxation, and petitions from the people. Each decision carried immense weight, whether to grant clemency, impose a levy, or order a new construction. With a word, lives shifted, fortunes rose or fell. Meals, though lavish by common standards, were often taken with restraint. Platters of roasted meats, breads, figs, dates, and honey wine were set before him. Yet, even dining could become ceremonial. The act of sharing food with honored guests reinforced bonds of loyalty. While private meals offered rare, respite from the endless gaze of courtiers. The afternoons might be devoted to reviews of military readiness, architectural plans, or religious rituals. The pharaoh walked temple courtyards, consulted oracles, and ensured that offerings to the gods were plentiful. To falter in these duties was unthinkable, for his personal discipline mirrored the state of Egypt itself. And yet, behind the formal facade, there were moments of humanity. The pharaoh might play Senate, the ancient board game of fate, or stroll through palace gardens filled with lilies, papyrus, and exotic animals. Children's laughter could echo in the courtyards, and the Queen's counsel might shape his most private reflections. Evenings drew him back to ritual. Incense curled into the night air, as priests intoned prayers for protection, health, and prosperity. The day closed much as it began, with ceremony, vigilance, and the quiet reminder that his life was never fully his own. For the pharaoh, there was no true separation between the personal and the political, the human and the divine. Every breath was part of the performance of kingship, every hour a step in the eternal dance of rule and ritual. Behind the towering walls of the palace, away from the public rituals and endless ceremonies, lay the heart of the pharaoh's private world. His family. Though often hidden from the eyes of common Egyptians, the royal household was a world of both intimacy and politics. The queen, often called the great royal wife, stood at the center of this sphere. Her role went far beyond companionship. She was the pharaoh's partner in upholding divine order. She appeared beside him in temple reliefs, participated in festivals, and sometimes even ruled as regent if her husband was absent or her son too young to reign. Queens like Nefertari and Hatshepsut became figures of immense power, remembered not just as wives, but as rulers in their own right. Royal children grew up within a world of privilege and expectation. Princes were educated in administration, military skills, and religion, preparing for the day when one might ascend the throne. Daughters often held influence too, sometimes marrying into foreign dynasties to secure alliances, or serving as high priestesses in temples. Their lives were not their own, but threads woven into Egypt's political tapestry. Beyond the immediate family, the palace bustled with extended relatives, concubines, and attendants. With multiple wives and children, rivalries were inevitable. Succession disputes could tear families apart, as brothers vied for the throne or mothers maneuvered for their sons' futures. The domestic chambers could be as fraught with intrigue as the royal court itself. Yet, amid the politics, moments of tenderness still existed. Reliefs depict the pharaoh playing with his children, lifting them onto his lap, or walking hand in hand with his queen. These glimpses remind us that behind the regalia and divine aura, the pharaoh was still a husband, a father, a man surrounded by those he loved. In the quiet hours of the palace, away from the gaze of courtiers and priests, the pharaoh's family shaped not only his private life, but also the destiny of Egypt. Their joys, rivalries, and ambitions rippled outward, influencing the fate of an empire. If the pharaoh was the sun around which Egypt revolved, then the royal court was the constellation of stars that glittered in his orbit. It was here, in vast audience halls and richly decorated chambers, that power was displayed, contested, and maintained. The vizier stood at the top of this hierarchy. As the pharaoh's right hand, he oversaw taxation, law courts, and record keeping. His word carried weight across the kingdom, and his loyalty was both essential and precarious. A vizier too ambitious might be seen as a threat, while one too timid could weaken the administration. Surrounding him were high officials, scribes who recorded decrees on papyrus, generals who managed Egypt's armies, overseers of granaries and fields, who ensured the lifeblood of grain kept flowing. Each position was coveted, for proximity to the throne brought both influence and wealth. But the court was more than officials. Musicians, dancers, and artisans filled the palace halls, entertaining the ruler and displaying Egypt's cultural brilliance. Foreign envoys arrived with tribute: gold from Nubia, cedar from Lebanon, incense from Punt, transforming the palace into a showcase of Egypt's global reach. The court was also a theater of etiquette. Protocol dictated every bow, every word, every gesture. A misstep could be fatal to one's career, or worse. The pharaoh's presence was treated with reverence, his throne approached only with elaborate ceremony. Even in whispers, courtiers guarded their words, for spies and rivals lurked in every shadow. Yet beneath the polished surface, intrigue bubbled. Alliances were forged over shared meals, plots murmured in hidden corridors. A noble might rise swiftly in favor, only to fall just as quickly into disgrace. The court's brilliance dazzled, but its dangers were ever present. For the people of Egypt, the court was a distant world, almost mythical. To them it embodied majesty and divine order. But within, it was a crucible of ambition. A place where loyalty and betrayal danced hand in hand under the watchful gaze of the pharaoh. While pyramids captured the imagination of later generations, it was the temples that truly embodied the living spirit of ancient Egypt. These colossal structures, carved with hieroglyphs and towering statues, were more than places of prayer. They were engines of society, centers of wealth, learning, and political power. Every temple was dedicated to a specific deity: Amun in Thebes, Horus at Edfu, Hathor at Dendera, but all shared the same purpose: to maintain harmony between the gods, the pharaoh, and the people. The temple was the house of the gods, and the pharaoh, as their earthly embodiment, was its master. Daily rituals unfolded with precision. At dawn, priests bathed, shaved, and clothed themselves in spotless linen before entering the sacred sanctuary. There, they awakened the statue of the god, washing it, dressing it in fine garments, and offering food, incense, and music. These acts symbolized renewal, the rebirth of order with each rising sun. Temples were also economic powerhouses. Vast lands, herds, and workshops were attached to them, with farmers, herders, and craftsmen laboring to sustain the temple's wealth. Offerings from across the kingdom poured in, enriching both the gods and the priesthood. The pharaoh's role was central. Even if he could not attend every ritual, he was depicted on temple walls offering mat, the symbol of truth and order, to the gods. These images were not mere art, but eternal affirmations that he upheld the balance of the universe. Without his presence, the cosmic order itself might falter. For the people, temples were both awe-inspiring and distant. Ordinary Egyptians rarely entered the inner sanctuaries, but they gathered in courtyards during festivals. There, the gods merged from the dark sanctuaries in golden barkis, carried on the shoulders of priests, while music, feasting, and prayer filled the air. Temples stood as bridges between earth and heaven, their colossal pylons like gateways to eternity. They were reminders that Egypt's prosperity was not just built on the Nile's waters or the pharaoh's power, but on the enduring faith that the gods watched over every harvest, every battle, and every breath of life. If the pharaoh was the face of divine authority, the priests were its hands and voice. They moved silently through temple halls, their heads shaved, their linen spotless, their lives devoted to ritual. Yet behind their quiet presence lay immense power, spiritual, economic, and even political. The chief priests of great temples, like those of Amun at Karnak, were second only to the pharaoh in influence. They controlled vast estates, thousands of laborers, and enormous wealth from offerings and tributes. In some periods, the wealth of the priesthood rivaled, or even exceeded, that of the crown itself, creating a delicate balance of cooperation and rivalry between throne and altar. Priests served many roles. Some were ritual specialists, tending to the daily needs of the gods' statues. Others interpreted omens, read sacred texts, and guided the pharaoh on matters of cosmic importance. Physicians often trained in temple schools, combining practical remedies with spiritual incantations. Even astronomers, who charted the stars to predict the Nile's flood, often came from priestly ranks. Their influence extended far beyond the sanctuary. For common Egyptians, priests were mediators with the divine. They conducted funerary rites, advised on festivals, and provided charms or amulets said to protect against illness or misfortune. Their words carried authority that could comfort or terrify the people. But with great power came intrigue. In times of weak rulers, priests could overshadow the throne, steering Egypt's destiny from behind the temple walls. In contrast, strong pharaohs sought to keep the priesthood in check, ensuring the god's servants remained loyal to the crown. The story of Akhenaten, who sought to dismantle the old priesthood in favor of his new son cult, reveals just how dangerous their power could be. Temples may have been houses of the gods, but priests ensured they were also fortresses of influence. To the people, they were guardians of the sacred. To the pharaoh, they were both allies and rivals. And to Egypt itself, they were an ever-present reminder that faith and politics were threads woven too tightly to ever unravel. Though much of Egyptian life was bound by ritual and duty, the calendar was dotted with moments of release and joy. Grand festivals that drew the entire community into the orbit of the gods. These were not quiet ceremonies but vibrant spectacles, overflowing with music, food, and color, where the sacred and the celebratory blurred together. Some of the most famous festivals were tied to the great deities. The Opet festival in Thebes, for instance, was a dazzling event where the statue of Amun was carried from Karnak to Luxor in a majestic procession. The pharaoh himself often joined, reinforcing his bond with the god and, by extension, his right to rule. There were also agricultural celebrations, timed with the flooding of the Nile or the harvest season. These ensured the gods' blessings for abundance and reminded people of the cycle of life, death, and rebirth mirrored in their land. During festivals, the rigid lines between classes softened. Commoners feasted, sang, and danced alongside nobles and priests. Ale flowed freely, musicians played harps and flutes, and dancers performed beneath the open sky. Streets became theaters, temples the centerpieces of a living drama. Behind the revelry, however, lay profound symbolism. Festivals were more than parties. They were spiritual recalibrations. They reconnected the people with the gods, renewed the pharaoh's authority, and symbolically restored balance to the cosmos. Even moments of laughter and joy had a ritual weight, a reminder that pleasure itself was a divine gift. For the Egyptians, celebration was not an escape from the sacred, but an expression of it. Every clap of a drum, every offering of bread or beer, echoed the eternal rhythm of life along the Nile, a rhythm that bound people, gods, and pharaoh alike in a shared act of devotion. When we think of ancient Egypt, images of powerful kings often dominate. Yet beside, and sometimes in front of these men stood women whose influence shaped dynasties and legacies. Royal women were not merely wives or ornaments of the court. They were political actors, spiritual symbols, and in rare but remarkable cases, sovereigns in their own right. The great royal wife, usually the pharaoh's chief consort, occupied the highest female position in the kingdom. She shared in rituals, was depicted alongside her husband in temples, and played a central role in ensuring dynastic continuity by bearing heirs. Beyond this, she often served as a trusted advisor, her presence reinforcing the pharaoh's divine image of balance and completeness. Mothers of kings also wielded enormous influence. A queen mother could act as regent when her son ascended the throne too young to rule, guiding affairs of state from behind the scenes. These women were frequently depicted as lionesses in both art and inscriptions, protectors of their children and guardians of Egypt's future. Then there were the rare queens who shattered tradition altogether by ruling as pharaoh. The most famous, Hatshepsut, donned the full regalia of kingship, including the false beard, and presided over one of Egypt's most prosperous eras. Centuries later, Cleopatra Viseve used her intelligence, charisma, and political skill to navigate the dangerous currents of Roman power, leaving a legacy still remembered today. Even women not seated on the throne had influence. Priestesses, noble women, and even entertainers played roles in the cultural and spiritual life of Egypt. Their voices echoed in hymns, their hands offered libations, and their lives, though less recorded, intertwined with the rhythms of palace and temple. To the Egyptians, women embodied fertility, continuity, and the protective force of the goddess Isis, in a world dominated by kings and gods. It was often women who ensured the survival of dynasties and carried forward the sacred bloodline of the pharaohs. If the golden facades of temples and palaces projected order and stability, the reality behind those walls was far more turbulent. The Egyptian court was a place where whispers could decide the fate of kingdoms, and ambition often proved more dangerous than foreign armies. The royal household was vast, filled with wives, concubines, princes, daughters, priests, generals, scribes, and servants. Each group had its own loyalties, ambitions, and schemes. At the center stood the pharaoh, whose authority was absolute, but whose position was never entirely secure. For every king, there was always the question of succession. Which son would inherit the throne, and which factions would rise or fall with him? Rivalries often began within the pharaoh's own family. Sibling marriages meant that brothers could become both allies and bitter enemies. Mothers maneuvered for their sons' futures, sometimes forging alliances with priests or courtiers. A single whispered accusation of disloyalty could end in disgrace, exile, or execution. Some of Egypt's most dramatic upheavals were born of such intrigue. The so-called harem conspiracy against Ramses III revealed the extent of palace plotting. Concubines, court officials, and even scribes banded together in a failed attempt to assassinate the king and place another prince on the throne. Their trial, preserved on papyrus, reads like a thriller: betrayals, coded messages, and ultimately, brutal punishments for the conspirators. Palace rivalries weren't limited to family disputes. Powerful priests and military leaders also vied for influence. A general who commanded the loyalty of the army could make or break a dynasty, while the high priests of Amun controlled vast wealth that rivaled the crown itself. Pharaohs who could not manage these factions risked becoming figureheads rather than true rulers. Despite the grandeur, life in the palace was anything but tranquil. Every feast, ritual, and council meeting could carry undercurrents of suspicion. Smiles hid ambitions, and gestures of loyalty often masked plots. For all their divine trappings, pharaohs lived with the constant knowledge that danger lurked closest to home. For Egyptians, the pharaoh was no ordinary man. He was the bridge between heaven and earth, chosen by the gods to uphold Ma'at, the universal balance of truth, order, and justice. His crown was not just a symbol of power, but of divine authority, and his every act was thought to ripple across both mortal and cosmic realms. Pharaohs were often described as the sons of Ra, born of a sacred lineage that bound them directly to the sun god. Their coronation ceremonies affirmed this bond, as priests invoked the gods to breathe divine life into the new ruler. From that moment on, the king was not merely a man. He was a living god, Horus in the flesh, destined to rule until he joined Osiris in the afterlife. This relationship was not symbolic alone. It demanded action. Pharaohs were expected to build temples, commission statues, and sponsor rituals that honored the gods. Each festival, each sacrifice, each offering was as much about ensuring Egypt's prosperity as it was about maintaining divine favor. To neglect these duties was to invite chaos and disaster, from failed harvests to foreign invasions. But the relationship went both ways. Pharaohs drew legitimacy from their closeness to the divine, yet they also sought to shape it to their advantage. Akhenaten famously redefined worship, elevating Aten, the sun disk, above all other gods, reshaping not just religion but politics itself. His experiment, though short-lived, revealed the immense risks and rewards tied to the divine contract of kingship. Even in death, the pharaoh's connection to the gods continued. Elaborate tombs, filled with texts and treasures, were designed to guide him through the underworld, where he would ascend as Osiris, god of the dead, and join Ra's eternal journey across the sky. His success in this cosmic transformation ensured not only his own immortality, but also the continued harmony of Egypt itself. In the end, the pharaoh's life was inseparable from his divine identity. To rule Egypt was not simply to govern people, but to embody the will of the gods, standing as their voice, their champion, and their earthly presence in an eternal cycle of life, death, and rebirth. Though Egypt's heart beat along the fertile banks of the Nile, its survival often depended on what happened beyond its borders. Pharaohs were not only guardians of the god's order, but also commanders of armies, leading campaigns that expanded Egypt's influence and secured its wealth. In the early dynasties, Egypt's military focus was local, defending fertile lands from desert raiders and securing trade routes. But as the kingdom grew, so did its ambitions. By the new kingdom, pharaohs such as Thutmose III and Ramses II led campaigns that turned Egypt into a true empire, stretching its reach into Nubia to the south and deep into the Levant to the north. These campaigns were not mere shows of force. They secured vital resources, gold from Nubia, cedar from Lebanon, and horses and chariots from Asia. Captives from conquered lands were brought back as laborers or soldiers, adding to Egypt's power. Victory in battle also reinforced the pharaoh's divine image, each triumph proof that the gods favored him and his reign. One of the most famous encounters was the Battle of Kadesh around 1274 BCE, where Ramses II clashed with the Hittites. Though the outcome was indecisive, it was immortalized on temple walls as a heroic victory, with Ramses charging into the fray like a god of war. In reality, it led to one of history's earliest recorded peace treaties, a reminder that diplomacy was as much a tool of expansion as the sword. Egyptian military power was built on discipline and innovation. Chariots, manned by archers, gave the pharaoh's forces speed and striking power. Fortresses along the frontiers acted as both defense posts and trade checkpoints, projecting Egyptian presence into hostile lands. Yet expansion came at a cost. Campaigns drained resources, and over time, foreign entanglements stretched Egypt thin. Later pharaohs struggled to maintain control, and invasions by powerful outsiders, from Libyans to Assyrians, revealed the limits of empire. Still, the image of the warrior pharaoh endured. striding into battle, smiting enemies beneath his feet, upholding order against chaos. For Egyptians, these victories were not just earthly conquests, but cosmic triumphs, proof that their king was both a soldier and a god. Chapter 18. Trade and Diplomacy. While chariots and armies projected Egyptian power, trade and diplomacy often proved just as vital to its prosperity. The pharaohs understood that wealth did not always flow from conquest. It also traveled on riverboats, caravans, and sea routes, bringing goods, ideas, and alliances from far beyond the Nile Valley. Egypt's natural bounty gave it much to offer: grain from fertile floodplains, papyrus for writing, and fine linen woven from flax. But it also hungered for luxuries not found at home. Gold from Nubia, cedar wood from Lebanon, copper from Sinai, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and frankincense from Punt were all highly prized. To secure these treasures, pharaohs invested heavily in trade networks. Some of the most legendary expeditions were to Punt, a land still debated by historians, but described in Egyptian records as a source of incense, ebony, exotic animals, and even dancing pygmies for the royal court. Queen Hatshepsut famously sent a grand fleet there, immortalizing the journey on the walls of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri. Trade often went hand in hand with diplomacy. By the New Kingdom, Egypt was part of an international order that included the Hittites, Babylonians, Assyrians, and Mitanni. Letters preserved in the Amarna archives reveal pharaohs exchanging gifts, marriage proposals, and political promises with other rulers. Gold was sent abroad in exchange for horses, while royal daughters were given as brides to seal alliances. These exchanges were more than mere transactions. They were symbols of prestige. To be recognized as a worthy partner by foreign kings was a way of affirming Egypt's place at the center of the known world. When conflicts arose, diplomacy could prevent costly wars, as seen in the peace treaty between Ramses VII and the Hittites, which not only ended years of hostility, but also established a long-lasting alliance. Through trade and diplomacy, Egypt extended its influence without drawing a sword. Markets and marriage ties became tools of empire, weaving the Nile Kingdom into a web of connections that stretched across the ancient world. For the Egyptians, prosperity was as much about negotiation as it was about conquest. Chapter 19. Daily life of the pharaohs. The image of a pharaoh often conjures visions of golden crowns, lavish banquets, and mighty decrees. But behind the grandeur lay a carefully structured daily routine, where ceremony, duty, and personal indulgence blended into the rhythm of royal life. A pharaoh's day began at dawn, when priests entered the temples to perform rituals, not only for the gods, but also in the pharaoh's name, reaffirming his divine role as the bridge between heaven and earth. In palaces, attendants and scribes brought reports, scrolls, and messages for the ruler to review. Decisions on matters of taxation, building projects, military campaigns, or foreign diplomacy often began with these early audiences. Meals for the pharaoh were far from ordinary. While peasants might subsist on bread and beer, the royal table featured roasted meats, fresh fish, fruits, honey cakes, and wine imported from the Levant. Banquets were both feasts and political stages, where courtiers, officials, and visiting dignitaries dined in awe of Egypt's abundance. Leisure also had its place. Hunting in the marshes or deserts was both sport and symbolism, proof of the pharaoh's strength and mastery over chaos. Chariot rides, archery, and athletic contests kept the royal body vigorous, a reflection of the godlike vitality expected of the ruler. Music, dancing, and storytelling provided entertainment in the palace halls, while perfumed oils and elaborate garments ensured the pharaoh radiated majesty at every appearance. Family life varied depending on the ruler. Queens often played vital roles, not only as consorts but also as political advisors, priestesses, and, at times, co-rulers. Royal children were groomed for future roles in governance, the priesthood, or dynastic marriages that strengthened alliances. Yet, beneath the opulence lay immense pressure. The pharaoh was not free to live idly. Every action carried symbolic weight. To appear weak, ill, or neglectful risked unsettling the delicate balance of Ma'at, the cosmic order. Even rest became part of the performance of kingship, as the ruler embodied both divine presence and human responsibility. In this blend of ritual, governance, and splendor, the pharaoh's daily life was less about personal freedom and more about enacting the timeless role of Egypt's eternal king. Every dawn was a reminder that the weight of the two lands rested squarely on his shoulders. To understand the life of the pharaoh is to step into a world where politics and religion were inseparable. The pharaoh was not just a monarch. He was the living Horus, the earthly embodiment of the gods, and the chief priest of the kingdom. Every ritual reinforced this sacred bond, linking the prosperity of Egypt to the ruler's devotion to the divine. Daily temple ceremonies began at sunrise, when priests acting on behalf of the pharaoh cleansed, dressed, and offered food to the statues of gods. Though the pharaoh did not personally perform each rite, his name and presence were invoked as though he stood in the sanctuary himself. This delegation of duty symbolized that all worship flowed through him, ensuring that the gods recognized Egypt's devotion. Festivals brought these divine relationships into full public view. The Festival of Opet in Thebes, for example, was a grand procession in which the god Amun was carried from Karnak to Luxor Temple, accompanied by music, dancing, and offerings. The pharaoh's participation confirmed his legitimacy and reinforced the idea that his reign was sanctioned by heaven. Rituals also extended to matters of state. Victories in war were dedicated to gods like Amun, Re, or Sekhmet, with inscriptions claiming divine guidance for every triumph. Even agricultural abundance was framed as the result of the pharaoh's ability to uphold Ma'at, the cosmic balance of truth, justice, and order. A failed harvest or natural disaster, by contrast, could be interpreted as a lapse in divine favor, placing immense pressure on the ruler to restore harmony through renewed offerings and piety. Funerary rituals, too, reflected this religious weight. When a pharaoh passed, elaborate ceremonies such as the opening of the mouth were performed to ensure that the king could breathe, speak, and eat in the afterlife. Tomb walls were covered with sacred texts and images showing the pharaoh's eternal journey through the underworld, guided by gods and protected from chaos. Religion, then, was not a private faith, but a public theater in which the pharaoh stood at the center. Each ritual, festival, and sacrifice reinforced the belief that Egypt's very survival depended on the ruler's communion with the gods. To break this sacred chain would be to invite disorder, famine, or invasion, a risk no pharaoh could afford. The world of the pharaoh stretched between two realms: the palace, where life unfolded in power and splendor, and the tomb, where eternity was carefully planned long before death arrived. Both spaces revealed not only the ruler's wealth, but also the deep symbolic weight of kingship in ancient Egypt. Royal palaces were not just residences, but centers of government and performance. Constructed from mud brick, these sprawling complexes featured vast courtyards, pillared halls, gardens, and storerooms. While little remains today, ancient accounts and surviving ruins suggest that palaces dazzled with painted walls, decorated floors, and fragrant gardens filled with lotus pools. Every design element emphasized the pharaoh's role as the earthly anchor of Ma'at, the cosmic order, Life inside the palace was busy. Officials, scribes, generals, and foreign envoys moved through its halls, waiting for an audience with the ruler. Servants ensured the constant flow of food, clothing, and entertainment. Musicians, dancers, and poets filled the air with art, while priests carried out rituals to reinforce the divine aura of the throne. To live in the palace was to exist within the center of Egypt's universe. Yet the palace was only half the story. For the pharaoh, eternity demanded as much attention as earthly life. From the moment of ascension, preparations for a tomb began, projects that could last decades. In the Old Kingdom, this meant building pyramids, colossal monuments of stone meant to bridge heaven and earth. Later dynasties favored hidden tombs carved into cliffs, like those in the Valley of the Kings, where elaborate wall paintings and texts guided the pharaoh's soul through the afterlife. Tombs were not simple graves but carefully engineered worlds. Vast treasures, chariots, weapons, and furniture were entombed alongside the king, offerings to ensure eternal comfort. Walls told stories of triumphs, religious rites, and the eternal journey of the soul. Inscriptions from the Book of the Dead or Amduat mapped the perilous path through the underworld, where the heart would be weighed against the feather of Maat. This duality, palaces for the living, tombs for the dead, captures the essence of pharaonic kingship. A pharaoh's existence was never confined to one lifetime. It stretched across the visible and invisible worlds. Every stone laid in a palace or tomb spoke of authority, piety, and the unbroken cycle of rule and rebirth. For centuries, the pharaoh had stood as Egypt's unshakable symbol of divine authority. Yet no kingdom lasts forever. The long arc of history saw the pharaoh's power wane, challenged by internal strife, foreign invasions, and the gradual erosion of the very beliefs that once upheld their throne. The first cracks appeared in periods of instability, known as the intermediate periods. Central authority collapsed, leaving rival rulers to claim kingship over fragmented regions. Nomarchs, regional governors, gained strength, and the once unified two lands splintered into competing fiefdoms. Without a strong pharaoh to command loyalty, the idea of divine kingship itself began to feel fragile. Foreign powers further chipped away at pharaonic dominance. The Hyksos, a people from the Levant, stormed into the Delta during the Second Intermediate Period, introducing new technologies like horse-drawn chariots and composite bows. Though they were eventually expelled, their occupation left Egyptians shaken by the realization that their divine king could be defeated. Later centuries saw repeated struggles against powerful outsiders: Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, Persians, and eventually Alexander the Great all imposed their rule on the Nile. Each conquest forced the pharaoh's role to shrink, from supreme ruler to puppet king, sometimes tolerated only to preserve tradition, while real power lay elsewhere. Even within Egypt, priests of powerful cults like that of Amun at Thebes amassed vast wealth and influence. In some eras, the temple hierarchy wielded more authority than the throne itself. This shift eroded the singular aura of the pharaoh, transforming him from divine monarch into one rival among many power players. By the time Rome annexed Egypt in 30 BCE, following the defeat of Cleopatra Syri, the last of the Ptolemaic rulers, the age of the pharaohs had ended. What had once been the world's most enduring monarchy dissolved into a province of empire. Cleopatra, remembered for her wit and political maneuvering, became the final echo of an institution that had lasted 3,000 years. The decline of Pharaoh's power was not a sudden collapse, but a slow unraveling, a reminder that even the mightiest divine kingship could not resist the tides of change. What remained, however, was their cultural legacy, monuments, myths, and memories that would continue to fascinate the world long after their crowns had turned to dust. Though the crowns and scepters of Egypt's rulers eventually vanished, the legacy of the pharaohs endured, etched into stone, myth, and memory. Their names, carved in hieroglyphs, still whisper from temple walls and colossal statues, testifying to the scale of their ambition and the reach of their power. The pyramids of Giza remain the most visible symbols of this legacy. Rising from the desert like timeless mountains, they remind us of the extraordinary organizational skill, labor, and vision of early pharaohs. These structures were not only tombs, but bold declarations that kings could touch eternity. Even today, they stand as one of humanity's greatest architectural achievements. Temples, too, carry the weight of pharaonic presence. From Karnak's towering columns to Abu Simbel's rock-cut sanctuaries, these spaces were designed to inspire awe, linking human devotion to divine power. Each relief and inscription was propaganda as much as piety, recording victories, offerings, and cosmic order as proof of a ruler's legitimacy. Beyond stone, the pharaohs shaped cultural identity. They crafted a vision of kingship that fused religion, governance, and daily life into a seamless whole. Their reigns produced art, literature, and technological advances. From advances in medicine and astronomy to systems of irrigation that fed generations. Even when political control slipped away, the cultural fabric woven under pharaonic rule remained intact. Their influence reached far beyond Egypt's borders. The image of the pharaoh fascinated ancient neighbors and continues to capture imaginations today. From biblical tales of Moses confronting a tyrant king to modern films and novels, the pharaoh has become an archetype, part god, part monarch, part cautionary figure. Perhaps most striking is the endurance of their names. Tutankhamun, Ramses, Cleopatra, figures whose lives ended millennia ago, still command global recognition. Each discovery of a tomb or artifact rekindles public wonder, drawing millions to museums and archaeological sites. In death, the pharaohs achieved what they had sought in life: immortality, not through divine ascension alone, but through memory and fascination that refuse to fade. The legacy of the pharaohs is a paradox. Their kingdoms crumbled, their power diminished, yet their story endures more vibrantly than that of many empires. They remind us that while political authority may fade, culture, art, and human imagination can carry rulers into eternity. As we draw this journey to a close, the story of the pharaohs reveals itself as both dazzling and sobering. For more than 3 millennia, Egypt's rulers commanded armies, raised monuments, and claimed to stand as the living link between humanity and the gods. They ruled over a civilization that left its mark in stone, in legend, and in the rhythms of daily life along the Nile. We have walked through their palaces, peered into their tombs, and witnessed the ceremonies that bound heaven and earth. We have seen their wealth and their struggles, their triumphs and their decline. Behind the golden masks and towering statues were human beings, bound by duty, belief, and ambition, trying to hold together a world where divine order and political power were inseparably entwined. The pharaohs remind us of the fragility of greatness. Their reigns, however mighty, were subject to famine, rebellion, and the tides of history. Yet they also remind us of the endurance of culture and imagination. Their pyramids still rise against the desert sky. Their names still spark wonder in the modern world. Their story, though ancient, feels ever present. In the end, the pharaohs achieved what they sought: above all, a form of immortality. Not as gods ruling the heavens, perhaps, but as enduring figures in human memory, symbols of both the heights and the limits of earthly power. So, as you close your eyes and let these stories settle, remember that history is not only about dates and monuments. It is about people who lived, dreamed, struggled, and left echoes strong enough to reach us across the centuries. The pharaohs were among the most extraordinary of these people. Their lives a reminder that even in the dust of time, greatness can still shine.